Hi everyone, welcome back to our panel discussion. So we have a very interesting panel lined up. The topic is red teaming conversations from the deep. We have with us Mr. O'Shea Bowens, Mr. Jeff Spielberg, Mr. Carson Owlett, and Mr. Tyler Robinson, who are going to take us through the next 1 hour discussing different questions and topics surrounding this particular title. So with that, I'm going to hand the stage over to them. They would like to introduce themselves to you. So I'm going to let them do that. Over to you, gentlemen.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. And thanks for having us. I hope everyone's having a good morning or good afternoon. As you said, I'm Moshe Bowens. I'll allow the participants and all the panel participants to introduce themselves. I think I'll just go last. So we'll kick things off with, I guess, Tyler.
Thanks, man. Appreciate just throwing me into the wolves. Good morning, everybody. Appreciate you guys taking your morning, afternoon, night. I don't know which time zone everybody's in. So my name's Tyler Robinson. I'm the offensive director at Trimarc Security and owner and founder of Dark Element Security. Got about 20 years of offensive security and IT experience. Focusing mostly on advanced emulation, physicals, ICS, a little bit of everything. You know, you spend enough decades in this industry and you happen to take on many hats. So very excited to be here and chat with you guys this morning.
Awesome. Carson?
All right. My name's Carson Owlett. Good morning or whatever, everyone. I am the founder and assessment team lead for Black Mirage, LLC. We provide offensive security services. I've been poking computers and servers since I was about 7 or 8. So, pleasure to talk to you.
Nice. Jeff?
Hey everyone, I'm Jeff Spielberg. I run commercial operations for Riverloop Security. We're a firm focused mostly in the embedded devices, IoT, and a little bit ICS space. So do a lot of hardware hacking and things like that. A lot of work for ISPs, medical device companies, and that sort of thing. My current research areas also focus on hardware supply chain security and secure boot and trusted platform modules.
Great, awesome. Then I'm Moshe Bowens, located in Boston, Massachusetts, founder and CEO of Null Hat Security. Mostly, I think I'm the outlier here because I primarily focus on the defensive side of security. So a lot of threat hunting, security analytics, security architecture, things along those lines. But it's always, I think as a defender, it's super important that you stay up and current to the majority of the red teaming techniques, because those change very frequently. So being a couple months or a year behind essentially means you're behind from a defensive perspective. Awesome. So so judging from everyone's background, everyone's pretty comfortable with the attacking aspect of security and a lot of the offensive research and development side of things. Is there and I know this is such a generic question, but is there a particular tool that you find yourself going back to, revolving back to, no matter what stage the attack cycle that you're in? You know, is there something that you recommend individuals take a look at, at least become familiar with if they're either getting into the offensive side of things, or maybe they're already into red teaming and they just don't know about it?
Microsoft Word. Be very proficient. No, I mean, in all seriousness, like one of the few tools that is forgotten is the tool of yourself and ability to articulate all of the cool technical stuff that you do with all of your tools, and being very proficient in technical writing and understanding tools to help you save time writing and do that well. I won't say that's my favorite tool. I'll circle back to something more exciting, but that is definitely an important aspect of the job.
So I can pop in here from the hardware hacking perspective. Different set of tools than probably a lot of folks are using day to day, right? I and my team have to look at signals in hardware and try and decode them and try and figure them out. There are a lot of open source tools, and actually I've been a part of trying to get some new open source hardware hacking tools out there And I am very guilty of this fact of we all try and make these tools that do everything and open source them, and the actual support for them long term is sometimes kind of shaky because we all get distracted with other things. So I have not found a ton of utility in sort of these do everything hardware hacking tools, but one of the things that we use every day is logic analyzers. These things, there's a company called Salier that makes these logic analyzers. You can plug them into any signal on any kind of board. It gives you a readout of the signal, and then you can start doing that sort of investigatory process of reverse engineering these things. And so what I found with tools is find those sort of fundamental things that give you like really high quality data, as opposed to the tools that claim they can find any kind of vulnerability. And those are the things that you're going to end up using for years and years.
Awesome. Good advice.
Piggybacking off that, I'd say, honestly, the basics, all the basic tools that you learn when you're starting off for pen testing, they will never, ever go out of style. Yeah, you might run up against that one client that's super hardened, but the majority of the time, your clients won't catch Nmap. They're not going to catch Burp Suite, any of the basics. Like, the stuff usually works, and it's around as a staple for a reason.
I would also say the built-in tools, like leveraging the tools that your developers are using the tools that your admins are using, leveraging tools the way that they're designed to be using. That helps you, one, blend in. Two, it actually provides a level of stability and functionality that is kind of hard to come by when you're talking about hacking tools. I mean, none of us are great devs. We don't maintain code very well. And let's be honest, we got into this to hack and not develop. Like, there's some fun things about development, but we're not great coders. At least most of us. I won't claim to be one of those. So really leveraging things like Microsoft RSAT, leveraging the server tools, leveraging tokens on a Windows system, and actually half the time I end up hacking from a Windows system. So leveraging things the way that they're designed to be used to blend in and get some great functionality out of them.
And you mentioned, I think Carson mentioned this a second ago, around the situation of running up against a hardened environment. This is something I was thinking about from a defensive perspective, and naturally, please do not give out any client information. But when you think about really hardened environments or systems that that definitely gave you roadblocks or caused you to kind of double back and rethink about your game plan in regards to that particular offensive assignment. What are some tips that you would give to maybe some of the managers that are listening, or individuals in decision-making positions around like hardening their systems?
Leverage the tools you have appropriately, like getting them tuned. Like, most of the tools out there, they're not fantastic. They're not perfect. None of them ever will be. But if you actually take the time and put some effort with coordinating both your offensive and defensive teams to tune those tools to actual attacks and get that kind of low false positive number, where it should be, so that you're actually responding to things that really matter and getting those prioritizations of those tuning and those different tools set in place. I think that makes a huge difference no matter what tool or technology you're using. Now, for really good technologies like what we've been seeing kind of across the board with mature organizations, is people that leverage particular stacks, such as the Microsoft stack. Anybody that's got, ATA configured, ATP configured, they got their O365 with conditional access set up. They've got all of these telemetries feeding in from Defender and their Intune policies. When all of these are playing well together and they're feeding and reciprocating data back and forth, that's when it becomes very, very difficult from an attacker's side to kind of get past that. You've got full visibility into most of the stack, and you're actually tuning those with good telemetry data, which Microsoft is doing a great job. You add some customized tuning to your environment inside of that, it becomes very difficult to move around.
I would say there are kind of two sides to these really hardened targets. The first, probably most important one that I find, is don't get discouraged. Figure out a way to stay happy and don't let this stuff drive you crazy, because it's awesome, and you feel awesome when you're up against a really soft target and you're finding all of these vulnerabilities. It's like, oh yeah, I'm awesome. I'm finding all these vulnerabilities. It's great. And it can be really discouraging to spend, a month on one target that you can't get anything on. That doesn't mean it's an issue with what you're doing. So there's a psychological aspect of you have to stay positive about that stuff, which I find to be probably the primary challenge. And I think the second thing is to like go back to the threat model. Like, where are all of those? Try and figure out a systematic way to go through what are all the access points, what are all the things you should be looking at and trying, and so that you can have a systematic way to establish, have I looked at anything and everything on these systems.
I don't know that I have a whole lot to add. You two covered it. You two covered it pretty darn well. Basically, just know your network, and then keep your eyes on everything. That's the easiest way to keep us out.
Yeah, I think there's a great graphic out there somewhere that's from quite a while ago of like the psychological roller coaster of pen testing, and it is a real thing. You will question yourself, wonder if you should go work construction or at the grocery store at some point in time, and really just keeping at it, understanding that you are all on the same team. If you run into a hard target, yeah, that's a great challenge for you, and keep that in perspective. But also understand that we have to praise those wins and those places that are doing a good job.
I don't know, some weird drop.
It's called that internet where you're at. So O'Shea, you're on the defensive side most of the time. What are some of the things that you're commonly seeing a lot of organizations deploy that they feel are doing a good job that may or may not be?
Sorry, I think it's having a bit of an issue hearing the audio. You can just continue the discussion. I'll try and get him back.
No problem. I was trying to remember what some of the other questions were. I guess what about some of the stories where we're seeing clients that are doing really good work, and we're seeing clients that are really not doing good work. We have a ton of people that are falling into the checkbox. We see a lot of people that are just looking for the scans. We've got a lot of automation on one side, and then we see a lot of people really trying to harden their organization and move forward. Why do you guys think there's such a divergence in some of the defensive capabilities for, both sides of the spectrum?
Well, I mean, I can't really speak to the as well. I can a little bit, but one of the engagements we had, it was very clear that two different subcontractors had been brought in for this government project. One of them had just set up the software side of things and hadn't locked any of it down. Admin got through everything, and it was open season on their user land. However, the admins the company that set up the infrastructure had hardened everything manually, and we saw Red Hat Enterprise Linux 3, and it had been manually patched for literally everything that had come out. So, is everyone still here? I can't see anyone.
Yeah, we're still here. We hear you, man.
Okay. Anyways, so the gist of it was basically one subcontractor had done a wonderful job, and they clearly had a good security culture there, and all of their people were clear as to what they needed to do. And I feel like the contract for the project just hadn't been explicit as to what the software side needed to do. So sometimes the requirements just are not clearly stated.
Yeah, I mean, I think building on that, you always see issues with different contractors working on standing up systems. Given that a lot of the work I do is on products that companies are selling, see a lot of issues in product development where they know that they have some security standard as a company. Don't leave port 22 for SSH open in a final production device, right? Like they have these standards, they have lists of things. But what they're not doing is during their planning and architecture stages, actually thinking about security and thinking about how to build things securely from the start. And during development, they're not thinking about things like, oh, I shouldn't leave my hard-coded development credentials in the code, right? So you end up with all this junk in production systems, really as a result of kind of poor R&D practices or poor deployment practices. So I think oftentimes, organizations can be really well intentioned about that stuff, but if they don't have across the stack and across their processes ways to proactively manage security threats in their systems, that's where I see things falling down a lot.
Do you see that, I guess, as we're moving forward, a lot of the, I guess, problems that I see in organizations is either one of two things. One, they have a disparate communication or relationship between different asset owners, or two, they don't have a top-down kind of support and approach. So with those two problems, is there a way other than opening up communication paths that you've seen that you can start to solve this technologically?
It's like the question of the century, trying to make teams that don't talk to each other talk using technology. I mean, I think the things that, and I've been a part of a couple of these, try and transform a culture around being proactive, around security measures and people talking to each other. I've seen a lot of teams try and put in place technological measures of, when you're doing X, this team gets notified of Y and things like that. And honestly, the best things end up being figuring out ways to get people to talk to each other proactively and just have conversations. That's incredibly tough right now with everyone being remote, with COVID. But ultimately, I think when it comes to security, it's less about putting gates in organizations and saying at this point in your life cycle, you need to do X, Y, and Z, and just making a culture around people talking to each other and trying to proactively address stuff is what I've found to be more effective.
And actually, to double down on the COVID part, thanks for taking over, Tyler. Hopefully I don't lag out again. But in regards to, I guess, the last almost year or so, with some of the engagements that you may have had, have you seen kind of a difference or a shift? I guess you would say a shift in the attack landscape due to COVID, with everyone going remote. It seems like a lot more. There seems to be this influx of successful breaches that have occurred, or successful attacks that have turned into breaches down the line, either and it doesn't seem like it's something due to a soft inside, right? It seems like there are companies that actually do have defensive practices or some layers of defensive depth, but due to the shift in COVID and everything that's happening, and who knows when we're going to get back to whatever our normal is. There's been I think an acceptance of really rushing to use different technologies for communications for remote workers that maybe you just don't purely understand, but from a business perspective, you need it to get people up and running, right? Have you seen kind of a shift and the attack landscape due to that?
I think I think this was in the works anyway. I think COVID just amplified and expedited this attack surface. We've seen single sign-on, we've seen SaaS applications starting to take such a huge hold and divergence with inside of organizations, and having these different SaaS applications, these single sign-on applications, and all of those federating back to probably something internally, more or less. You've got all these disparate technologies that hold a ton of data. Now, you don't have to go get domain admin or get internal access or exploit something externally to get in. You just have to password spray something on the outside or find an application password that's not two-factored. And now you've got a plethora of information on any given company and their communications to monitor that. So I think we've seen a lot of that kind of just expedited. And right when COVID was starting to happen, we also kind of foreshadowed the fact that there was going to be a ton of exploitation this year. I think there's been a ton of CVEs. There's a ton of software vendors that are getting hammered because everybody's had to move out to their house or work from home situations. And those technologies are now what's supporting them. They don't have the really hard external infrastructure, visibility, SOC teams, all of those things looking at them continually. They have a very disparate workforce that has the kids' iPads on it doing work remote school, as well as all the Flash applications that these school applications require. So I think it's just it's going to be the year of exploitation for a long time. We're going to see consumers' hardware being targeted very heavily. I think we'll see a whole bunch more exploitation around, consumer routers, consumer IoT devices, all of these botnets that have been prevalent. I think they're going to become exponentially more because that access is now being looked at, being sold off, and then being leveraged from an enterprise standpoint.
Yeah, something I've been meaning to write like a blog post about this, but this is something I've been hammering for years around like protecting your home, right? So like that shell, don't think about, that inner shell or outer shell existing only within the organization. Like what the hell, or sorry, what the heck, like what the heck do you do at your house, right? So like, I know I like when I have buddies come over, like there's usually at least like two different network systems that they're on, right? Like none of my servers that I run at home for whatever reason, research, whatever, for work, are definitely are on a network that they could easily discover, right? They would have to work a little hard just to get it. Not to say it's impossible, because nothing's like really impossible when it comes to systems, but it's on a network that they can't easily get to, right? Like pretty much majority of the applications I use are two-factored, and it's not to say like I think I'm untouchable, like I know I'm not, but it's literally just to allow like that level of really that level of security and that segmentation, right? Like I don't allow, as much as I love my wife's laptop is not on the same network that I'm on, right? Like that's on a totally different network, and I've spoken to her IT staff before when she got locked out, which was kind of I wish I recorded the conversation, but I was on my laptop, and her IT staff, they took like very little time to like verify who I was, and they're like, okay, we're gonna send you this binary that you can run, and this will set up the VPN. I'm like, oh, I'm on my computer. They're like, well, you can test on your computer too. I was like, nah, dude, you definitely should send it to me. Like I'm gonna ignore that part, and we're gonna skip past that. I'm gonna allow you to continue helping my wife out, because they were essentially running into issues like on the network she was on. So it was just like this weird, it's almost as if the stopgap is there, but you want to go over it. So it's like, dude, like they want to get their job done as quickly as possible, get people back up to work. People that are working in IT departments, right? As weird as it sounds to say, like they're essentially on a clock with, how many people they can actually get out the door, how many tickets they can close out. There's still a lot of that ticket counting happening within like normal IT operations. So I think, yeah, like in regards to like what we're going to see a lot of this year, I think that you're going to see a lot more software vendors getting hit, a lot more software being installed that totally hasn't been vetted and tested. Maybe it's occurred outside of like whenever they had that penetration testing cycle. So they have it, once a quarter, maybe that quarter's already gone. Now they're installing a bunch of crap to get people up for remote work that, normally they would have a chance to test, right? So it's I don't know, it's going to be a weird year.
Yeah, I think you saw a lot of factors come together in this past year. So big shift that I saw were organizations exposing things like, saw this time and time again of VoIP phone systems, right? For like call takers and just general corporate use. The organizations who never used to let that traffic outside of their internal networks started putting these phones in people's homes. So two things happen, right? You take the SIP devices that control all the traffic for those, you start exposing them to the internet, and you take these internet connected phones and you put them in all these people's houses. At the same time, as you're talking about home IoT, it's sort of now it's commonplace, right? Everyone has it. And I think probably a lot of people on the call today can set up separate VLANs and protect their home networks and stuff like that. But 99.9% of consumers don't know how to do that. They can't do that. And so I think one of the things we're going to see over the next year or two is a lot of companies coming out with consumer-facing products to try and help them in the home with security, especially around IoT. We're already seeing that a little bit with some ISPs getting into that, and folks who make routers and gateways try and get into that market. But I wouldn't be surprised more. Security historically has never been something that's sold to consumers. But I think we may see, as a result of all this, we may see that shift in the next year or two of as a consumer, you can go to your electronics store and buy some appliance for your house that segments your network and does something, right? Whether it does it securely, whether it does it well, whether it does it in a way that's not backdoored remains to be seen. But I think we're going to see that shift more and more.
I think that zero trust architecture and some of the more unique thought patterns around how you actually make connections between devices and what the internet is actually utilized for from a corporate standpoint. I think a lot of the traditional mindsets, this is opening up a opportunity to makeshift, get buy-in, and provide a kind of different way or different approach of doing security. And I think there's some really good solutions out there that are on their way. Things like Zscaler, Edgewise, or Guardicore, like a lot of these that are doing fundamental, like point-to-point secure. Got to have the right binary, the right person, the right time, come from the right IP address, and only across this, secure tunnel. Like these individual things where we don't trust anything. We don't trust the device. We don't trust the browser. We just don't trust anything, and everything is done in a different manner. I think that's where we're headed, and I have a lot of hope for technologies that can push us that way and do this well. But we are still a little ways out.
I mean, have you seen an environment that actually has zero trust like implemented throughout its entirety? Like I've seen it where, over the last probably 2 years since zero trust has been, quote unquote headline. It's on the front page of a lot of security publications, and Gartner pushes it forward. But majority of the time when I've seen this coming in from a consultancy perspective on the defensive side, it's typically in either some payment processing area, like one part of the network and systems are segmented, and that has zero trust, or it's this very, very small test bed that's been tested for almost 8 to 9 months, close to a year, and they still haven't rolled it out. Like I've yet to see it across.
It's still in audit mode.
What's that?
It's still in audit mode. That's usually what you end up seeing. It's still auditing everything.
Yeah. So I think, and this isn't. I want to be careful how I phrase it, because I don't think it's the end all be all, like moving to zero trust, because it's still relying on like one key factor that's just like the human. So I think if you have a human's behavioral patterns down, like from a time perspective, and I think it's hard. It may be harder to get like a keylogger or something on the system to try to understand like what he's actually doing from a login access, when the login is actually based upon like time, and it's more based on time and like certain systems that he uses or they use. It doesn't have to be a he, but I'm definitely excited to see what comes down the line, because it may make my life a lot easier.
Yeah, and again, as from an attacker standpoint, like everybody's always like, Pentesting's dead, Pentesting's going to die. We got all these technologies, it's so hard. It's still not the case, and I really don't see that as being the case even over the next 10 years, even as the really good places improve. Like we've always come down to finding a way around it, like the creative hack. Like there's always a human at the other end of this building it. There's always technology. There's always use cases. There's always business risk that gets overweighed by the business. So security, I think, is always going to be a thing. And so just getting that mindset right and understanding that this isn't going to go anywhere. You just have to be more creative, and you always have to step your game up. Like that continual learning thing for especially the offensive side. We have to know a lot of different technologies and, know them inside and out, fundamentals and all the base stuff. And then we have to figure out how to break them on top of that. And that's usually the creative side of it. So I don't think that's ever going to change. There's always going to be a cat and mouse game. So just continuing that evolution is how it's going to play out.
Yeah, something I've been kind of curious about, and when I say I've been curious about it, I mean, it's really been about a 5-day, maybe a 5 or 6 day type of like, let me perform a bit more research into this, because I've seen this before in regards to actually building out secure systems where you have access to code repositories to create those pipelines around like rapid deployment and and really scaling out. You have an application that you have. You Q&A'd and you're lining that up to go out sometime soon, and you want to ensure that connections to those specific pipelines are available, or connections to that specific repo, whether it's GitLab or GitHub, whatever it may be. And during that testing period, you've opened it up to not only like one development team, but you've opened it up to like, you know, a QA team, possibly 2 or 3 dev teams. And in that time, like you didn't necessarily, I don't want to say audit the key here, but you didn't necessarily keep a running list of who has access to that and kind of review that over a month-to-month basis. And, you know, I saw one attack last week where someone was able to get inside of an organization, get onto a dev's machine. You know, they were able to laterally move from a machine outside of the dev group, get to the dev machine. And from that dev machine, they saw that he had already stored his credentials like from CLI directly into that repository. So the attacker was able to go from the dev machine into the repository, and then once he got into there, I'm assuming it was a he because it's usually guys that do this. So it's not as if I'm like some sexist person, but it's usually guys that are doing this type of stuff. Once they got in, you know, they pretty much had unfettered access into at least a few different parts of their code bank. Some that was relevant to like critical systems around specifically credit card processing and credit card payment storage areas. And I'm curious if you have like, you know, one, if you've seen any attacks kind of like taking that shape, right? Like attackers are really thinking about, you know, I know that this is a fast development company. I know this company focuses on XYZ development side of application stuff. Like, is there something that, you know, that attackers are thinking about in regards to like, once I'm in, I need to identify where code pipelines are, where repositories are. Like, that's something I need to get to ASAP because, you know, maybe that's the end goal, or maybe that's the launching pad, right? If I can get in and you know, shift some of the code around in a repository, maybe no one catches it and maybe they deploy it, right?
Yeah, I mean, the developers and the cloud admins are the new DA, in my opinion. They're pretty much one of our first targets exclusively, because you get something like the AD Connect account or anybody that's inside of the Azure admins group. You've got that federation back and forth that's often a lot less monitored. A lot of what you're after is application keys that will, you know, be shared up into that and federated with single sign-on. So code is, you know, the ability to infect the code or do something with the code. I mean, you look at all the supply chain attacks, right? SolarWinds a great example. That's where you're going to be the most effective and have the farthest reach with the lowest impact. And then you start to think about things like your SaaS applications again. If you're after HR or PII, like all of those are going to be living in an Azure probably or AWS database that's being served up through an S3 bucket. So all these things are now shifting out to kind of the cloud, and the developers are the ones that have to make all these pieces tie together, and their code's making all this tie together. So they're the targets now. And I think we've leveraged them substantially over probably the last 2 years, and it's getting even worse.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think build pipelines in general are always a weak point. I think part of that is a result of, you know, it's not something that everyone in an organization understands. Oftentimes, like I was working with an organization this week and they needed to make some changes to some build pipelines. And they said, oh, you have to go to this person. They're the only one who can understand it, who understand it and can make changes, because otherwise everything will break and we like can't release product for the next 3 months if we break it. Right? They're oftentimes in a lot of organizations that have grown a lot. They're kind of fragile. They sort of work. No one's really checking if they're meeting spec to what they expect they're doing. So I think, you know, to Tyler's points, software supply chain is going to become a bigger and bigger issue. Kind of related to that, one of the issues that I see a lot, especially in the embedded device world, everyone's using third-party libraries in their build pipelines. Oftentimes, if it's vendor libraries, not like open source stuff, you don't have source code for those. They get compiled in at build time in these build pipelines. And so you're basically trusting some third-party thing that you're compiling into your main application at build time. You don't really know what's in there. I think that's another huge risk from just a total lack of security visibility. And that can provide some interesting, when then you're going out and testing systems or devices, looking at everyone who uses a certain vendor for, in my world, I'll use the example of every device that has a Wi-Fi chip from a certain vendor, but we could use that in the software world as well. We can start finding commonalities to attack across those things and common vulnerabilities that the organizations building those systems really don't have much control over.
You start to think about pre and post build scripting too, and the developers that are introducing codes into libraries that then get ingested into other, programs that are, like you said, compiled and you have no control over. It gets very interesting from an attack standpoint. Like if I was an attacker, in fact, we've seen this against security researchers recently, where the pre-build and post-build attack just in some scripts, like, hey, look at the 0 day. With inside of that, there was a pre and post build attack that was built into some code that they were evaluating. So there's a lot of sneaky ways to kind of get into that. UFEI is going to be another one I think is going to be pretty big with BIOS level and that network stack being available. Like we'll just have much more persistent and nasty ransomware starting to target people.
Yeah, and to bring that back to a pen testing perspective, right? The things you can do there are always making sure you are doing a really thorough enumeration of what are all the processes running, where did they originate, are they first or third party stuff, right? If it's, again, I'm sorry, I'm very device centric, but on devices, I look at firmware and enumerate, what is, it's a really annoying, laborious process, and you can try and automate some of it, but you'll never get there of like, what is every piece of software compiled into this thing? That can provide you a lot of insight and a lot of attack points as a pen tester to look at. Sometimes more than you can do in, a 4-week pen test or whatever it is. But those things are often really big weak points.
Yeah, no, I think that's like awesome advice too. And don't worry about bringing the device side of it in. Like we could all use something that we don't touch every day. So it's awesome. It's awesome to hear about it. And this is more of a fanciful question. Like this was something I was asked like 2 years ago. 2 months ago on like this podcast, and it was an odd question, and it kind of made me think. But if you had the ability to create your own custom 0 day, let's just say like I shouldn't say develop it. Let's just say you could buy it, right? Like there's someone on some marketplace somewhere that's like, hey, I'll fulfill your attacker fantasy. I have the capability to build whatever, right? Like, if you had that kind of dream O day, like what would that look like, right? I'll go to Carson on that.
That's a tough question. There's a lot of different things that you could go after. I mean, basically something that gets you into every domain registrar. Suddenly you control Windows updates, you control everything. Like, I mean, honestly, it would have to be the software for domain registration. Some kind of takeover within that. I mean, it literally would give you everything.
Okay.
I would like to see something, a UFEI C2 channel that does UPnP punch through on the firewall for reverse connections. That's my unicorn.
That's oddly specific. Probably shouldn't ask more.
I was thought about this.
Yeah. I think the 0 day world's fun too. No, go ahead, man.
I was going to say, I'm always interested in protocol stuff. So I've done a bunch of work on the ZigBee wireless protocol and finding some sort of by design systemic weaknesses in there. It's used for ICS sensors and some home IoT. I think, we've seen over the last year or two a bunch of stuff in Bluetooth, but no, often they're against like one vendor's chipset or something like that. So for me, I'm actually with a couple team members digging into some research in that area because like protocol vulnerabilities and those kind of things just have such a huge impact. I mean, frankly, I hope we don't find something there. But those sort of things are, especially in those protocols that end up getting really widely adopted, I always find pretty interesting.
NTP. Everything has to have NTP. It's in every segment. Like I need an NTP RCE. That would be like that kind of goes along with that DNS. If we coupled that DNS one, you take over the registrar and get all my traffic to where it needs to go, and I'll get the code execution with NTP.
It's on every system. So yeah, you're right. And when I had to think about how to phrase this one, but when you think about, some of the typical movements you would see an attacker like conduct inside of an organization, like, are there any tips that you would give, individuals that are focusing on the defensive side to kind of look for, right? Like, I know I look for weird lateral movement, right? Like that's usually one of the first things. If I'm coming in from a consultancy perspective, I'm like, give me a dump, give me a dump of like 80, I want to see authentications across like different time periods. And then there's certain open source tools I use to kind of graph that out and then determine like, hey, why is XYZ essentially authenticating at this time, right? Or why is XYZ touching the system? So a lot of movement and still looking at like token abuse, like things like that are kind of what I look at immediately when I'm called in, right? But I'm looking at it from purely a defensive side to kind of either A, identify, where the attacker is, and then B, kind of like help kick them out, right? Like that's kind of like our primary focus. But are there any tips that, you'd recommend individuals to kind of take to heart? It doesn't have to be relevant to a specific piece of like tooling from an attack perspective, but just something that, hey, you may want to look at this.
Focus on the fundamentals. Like honestly, as an attacker, we still have to do action. That's one of the things a lot of people forget. You still have to execute code on an endpoint, and you still have to be able to laterally move, and you still have to use credentials. And so focusing on like endpoint firewall, even if you have a simple firewall rule that blocks deny workstation to workstation communication on 445 and any below that, I don't care. Like that right there stops probably 60% of like ransomware and lateral movement like within an organization, because I have to have credentials to make a lateral movement. In order to get credentials, I got to be able to get to different places to make multiple hops. And so you're adding those detection points, those visibility gates. So as you're designing things, just focus on the fundamentals. If you can detect and add more areas of detection and make it a longer path for me to have to get somewhere, you're going to see it. Just that time to detection, time to remediation threshold is critical.
Great. And well, I mean, no, I think it's good advice. So I'm taking.
I'm just waiting for Carson and Jeff. Just
not my area of expertise. I'll let other folks answer this one.
I'm sorry, I completely missed the question. My connection's been dropping for the last 3 minutes.
Yeah, it's all good. No. The question was, is there like a specific tip that you would give individuals responsible for like managing systems, or for individuals responsible for like managing systems from a day-to-day perspective, or even people that are maybe operating on a defensive side of things, like tips you would give kind of identifying attackers within the environment, right? So not to give away like any of your secret sauce, but something you think that's worthwhile, and essentially saying, hey, take a look at this, at least once a week, once a day, once a month, whatever.
Honestly, just asset discovery. Make sure that every device that's supposed to be there. If you see a rogue one, that's usually an implant on a physical engagement.
I think that's good advice too, because asset management is super hard. Like those companies that are making millions and millions of dollars each year, purely from an asset management perspective of identifying devices within the environment. But the thing that I find, no matter who, I'm not going to pick on any like asset management company, but the thing that I find across that is if you can get like the naming nomenclature down, it's a lot easier to blend in, because I've definitely seen attackers like leverage host names and essentially going pretty much like using trailing bits and changing one letter or one specific identifier within the host name, and you totally look over that. Like I've been guilty of that. I'm like, that looks like an L, but it's actually an I, or that looks like an L, but it's a 1, right? Like that's not a part of like the nomenclature that they use to like identify their systems. And if you slip past that, like that's, you basically prolonged your investigation, right? Like if they slip past asset management, and you can't identify them. And then, especially if you don't have a way to kind of dump all systems that have like, let's just say EDR or something along those lines, right? Like if you haven't found a way to actually compare a dump against asset management, a dump against whatever tool you're using from an EDR or NDR perspective, and you can't combine that to look for those outliers, like I think you're in like a weird position where you're paying a crap load of money to have these tools in, and you can't really use them together.
Yeah, and I think a real good tip is understand your business, understand the business, how you make money, what's valuable in your business, and start to focus on what credentials, what accesses, what systems have access to that business critical, functionality, or however you make your money, or whatever's going to be leveraged against you, whether it's reputational damage, whether it's PII, PHI, like all those things, and then start to build from there out rather than try and get this massive picture where it's really hard to chunk down and eat this whole elephant. Like start to build from the center out, because as an attacker, again, we're back to, we have to go after very critical pieces of information. If you're our target and we understand your business better than you do, and we know what we're going after, you really do need to make sure that you're putting the emphasis in building the controls around that. And that can be done with pretty specific things, especially with Active Directory and getting some good fundamental AD security and cloud security around your data, really understanding what your data is and then understanding what your systems are, but being very intentional around how and where you put your priorities and begin to build the security model from that defensive layer from the inside out.
Yeah, I think that's a solid point. Has there been, this is kind of a selfish question, but has there been something like that's occurred over the last couple of weeks that one of you saw and read over and like, oh my God, that's sick, right? Like, like I saw the, I guess the identification, and then I guess the fix for like 3 of those iOS 0 days, right? Like that were out. I guess this was a week ago. What's today? I want to say this was a week ago. Like this was out, but they never actually. I don't know if there's been any additional reporting, but no one's actually identified like who actually found the 0 days. It's some unknown researcher found like 2 or 3 0 days for iOS, and then there's still no mention of where in the wild like it could have potentially been used, right? So it's one of these things like maybe we'll find out. My gut tells me we're going to find out over the next couple of months, and then the report's basically going to be like, attacker leverages iOS vulnerability. By the way, don't worry about it; it's already been fixed. But the damage has been done for. I'm guessing it's against an organization because it wouldn't make sense to burn like an iOS vulnerability against a single person. That's kind of how I feel. Like why would you go that deep for one particular person? Like it has to be maybe an organization that has their proprietary phones that they give to their employees, or maybe iOS or. It's something like that. I have no idea. It had me really, really curious, and I thought it was really interesting. I dug into it, and it led to like a dead end because there's literally no information about it out there. But has there been something that's occurred over the last few weeks that got either any of you like just like really kind of head first into kind of researching it?
Visual Studio Code. Oh, sudo, yeah, sudo was a big one. Visual Studio Code, the repo push. Basically, they could write to Visual Studio Code repo, and so they uploaded a comment into the repo and let Microsoft know. So remote repo pushes, I think, again, a supply chain attack, right? Like those libraries, those applications were leveraging those, and the sudo one. The sudo one, I'm still really fascinated with because it is so specific and so technologically deep at what they were looking at and how they got to where they were getting with sudo. And an old binary.
I guess in case no one's heard of that, do you want to give like a really quick like I guess just like some background on the sudo one, because it is crazy interesting. I think you could cover that for like 2 hours probably.
Yeah. So at a high level, like basically there's a privilege escalation to bypass sudo or utilize sudo. Which is the elevation application that elevates you to a higher token within inside of Linux or Unix, right? There was a privilege escalation within inside of that recently with a whole bunch of like character string, buffer overflow where they're writing to specific memory and they're bypassing ASLR. There's a ton there's a ton of technical depth to it, but they were very specifically looking at it and came up with a workable exploit that affects basically every sudo or every Linux distro from now all the way back to, I think it was like 2007 or something. It was something way back. So basically you can get to root all the things that are protected with inside of Dockers, all the things that leverage sudo, all the applications that have sudo ramifications, all of those can be bypassed, and you can basically gain privilege escalation via this path. So really bad.
Yeah, I immediately thought about cloud systems because most of those AMIs that come from like AWS, like a lot of those are like older Linux subsystems. I mean, it's built on top of like Linux subsystem, but those are a lot of, those aren't as easily, I don't think it's easy for AWS to essentially roll out a new AMI, you know, really quickly, right? Like they can't say that this particular version of Ubuntu or this particular version of Red Hat is vulnerable. Let me go ahead and like upgrade, you know, the AMIs for millions and millions of people. Like when I read about the sudo thing, I was like, that's gotta suck for AWS to try to figure this out in a very short period of time before we start reading about more people, like more attacks like leveraging this, right? Like it's super scary too.
And not even that, just like the hypervisors, right? And you think about all the cloud providers, and then you think about the images under those cloud providers, and then you think about the poor cloud providers that are lower staffed and lower resourced.
True. I can think of one that's in Cambridge that may be right into an issue.
Yeah, I think similar to that, not as this one came and went very quickly, but DNS puke that came out maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, vulnerabilities in DNS mask, which is the service on sort of the endpoints running, you know, DNS caching and all this sort of thing that can and it's on, you know, the out-of-the-box DNS mask is on Cisco devices and Aruba devices, and so it affects all these ISPs and, you know, SMB gateways and all this kind of thing, allowing for DNS cache poisoning and potentially a buffer overflow leading to RCE on these devices. So that again it didn't get, because I think it came out a couple days before the sudo issue, it didn't quite get the visibility there, but that was a really interesting one. And I mean, this again, like sudo, this stuff has been around forever, and we're still finding these sort of pretty critical issues with it. So I thought that was an interesting one.
NAT slipstreaming. I'll add to that. That DNS one with some NAT slipstreaming. That's a pretty lethal combination. Like your ability to jump behind a firewall, and like NAT, we rely on NAT to protect us for basically everything. Like it's the fundamental firewall aspect, right? If you can bypass NAT and slipstream to the backside of that, I see a whole bunch of issues that we're putting a lot of trust into a single kind of protocol.
What? Just out of curiosity, I don't remember this. Was there a fix for it, or is it still you know out there?
I think they had like a temporary fix for their product, but this affected more than just a single product line. And yeah, it's similar to the one that was, I think, 2 or 3 months ago, except this one's way more stable and applies to a lot of other different NAT protocols.
Right. So, sorry, related to the DNS puke stuff, or because that, I mean, this stuff is going to have to end up getting, you know, to what we were talking about earlier, third-party libraries, right? That stuff is going to have to get patched in the base library and then, you know, built into everyone else's products and systems. So it's going to take a while to really patch that stuff. Luckily for the sudo, you know, the sudo patch, most folks had a patch out pretty quick. So I think, like, you know, when I was looking at the network of stuff that I run, the thing we were waiting on was the Raspbian Raspberry Pi patch. You know, that was the laggard there, but you know, everything else got patched pretty fast for that one. So
I think about all those IoT devices too. Like some of those are either end of life or aren't going to have a firmware update, or those libraries are not going to get pushed. So
yeah, for sure. I mean, I deal with this every day of folks saying, we don't really want to, oh yeah, there's a vulnerability in this third-party library we use. Doing firmware updates in the field, they're really risky, or they don't actually really work. Not going to do it.
hopefully it's not something I use, but and I guess when it comes to like this is since you said this, Jeff, and now I'm thinking about this a bit more. When it comes to the IoT vulnerabilities and identifying those, do you find that there's overwhelmingly like this? Yeah, it's vulnerable, but we'll get around to it later, or the time to cost comparison of us actually going out, let's just say something to fill, right? It's something with, it's IoT or it's SCADA or something along those lines. Because I have buddies that work in like the oil industry, and for them, it's the cost benefit analysis is like we have to fix it, right? Like if it's oil pumps or something that's doing underwater drilling, like they are like pretty much on top of it. They're acutely aware of the vulnerabilities that exist, like on the SCADA side, right? Like they know like what's up, and there's usually some timeline associated with remediating those vulnerabilities, right? But again, that's like, borderline critical infrastructure if you think about oil pipelines and drilling, right? Especially if you think about it from a national perspective. But when you think about, just IoT devices out there and then companies that are constantly making new versions of whatever, or whatever that device is or whatever they're selling, do you see that there is a push to remediate as fast as possible? Or is it, hey, we have something else in the pipeline coming out, dude, don't worry, we'll get around to it with the new release?
Ooh, that's a tough question. Let me break it down I'm going to try and break it down into a couple categories of what I see. Okay, so critical infrastructure stuff, you're totally right. Folks are hesitant to patch critical infrastructure stuff. Largely, it comes down to a concern about availability, right? So availability trumps everything when it comes to critical infrastructure, because you don't want to risk taking down your devices, or even you don't want to risk having a micro change in functionality of, let's say, an oil pipeline controller or something like that. Mm-hmm. Like a 2% change in like response time for something in a factory or on an oil pipeline might really have an impact on safety or things like that. So there's an emerging field of, and this is still research stuff, but there's an emerging field around binary micro patching and trying to look at how you can apply security patches to binaries without changing their functionality. So today the deal is, probably not going to get patched. There's a big field of research to try and figure out how we can do that stuff better in the future. When it comes to the commercial stuff and consumer devices, yeah, I mean, it really falls into, there are folks who, once it's distributed out into the field, it is what it is. It's not going to get patched. But there are some vendors out there, especially now that there are larger companies and ISPs are taking responsibility for some devices and things like that. And there are better platforms to do this, like Azure Sphere, to help actually kind of manage IoT at scale. And you still need to build a lot on top of that. But there are some systems now where we are seeing folks take a more serious approach to patching stuff. I'll say the big limitation I find often is on these devices, when folks try and patch security issues, they don't have enough code space, they don't have enough memory, it takes too much processing power, right? So those are the cases where everyone has to say, screw it, we're going to wait till our next version of the product or something like that. But those are, I guess, maybe for the camps that things fall into, and it really depends. I mean, we're still seeing, there's no standard in the industry for this stuff yet.
That's frightening, but okay.
Yep.
And just to hammer back on something you said from the binary patching side, what exactly does that look like?
So the idea here is like, okay, so let's say I'll use an example we see all the time. So OpenSSL, which is used in every embedded device as the library to establish TLS connections. It's always historically been full of vulnerabilities, right? And people hate patching it because their APIs change. And so upgrading to a new version to fix a security patch in your code can actually be a big to-do. It's more work than just replacing the library with the new version, and requires a ton of testing. So the idea is, how can you actually like do surgery on a compiled binary to fix the security issue, right? Like patch the buffer overflow or something. But otherwise not change the functionality of all of the other stuff around it, right? So if you have something running a really like a real-time critical system in a factory or something, the functionality of that binary remains exactly the same. The runtime remains the same, but you've been able to kind of yank out the part that was vulnerable and put it in this patch. So the actual technical stuff underlying that, I've been talking with I have some folks on my team doing the research there. I don't understand how it actually works. It sounds really cool, but I couldn't tell you from a technical level how that actually happens to do those patches.
Yeah, I'll have to read some more into that. I know we're coming close to time. Was there anything that you guys wanted to kind of throw out there and discuss with the last like 4 or 5 minutes that maybe we didn't cover? I'll look for questions really fast in the audience. Okay, I'm not saying one. I'm gonna ask one. Feel free not to not to answer if you don't want to name, a specific vendor. I think I know what Carson's gonna say, but in regards to exploiting like endpoints and gaining access, maybe thinking about even getting root to a specific endpoint, are there any, I don't want to say specific like EDR vendors that throw up roadblocks in regards to, owning a host, but do you guys see that as, a deterrent, I guess, in a sense, right? Like, I guess it depends on how you look at it. Like, there's different types of software out there from NDR, DDR that are doing different things. But, they all promise a lot. And then, me being on the defensive side, I've seen probably almost every EDR vendor that's out there over the last like 3 or 4 years. I've seen like at least one environment that has one of them. So I've probably seen them all over the last couple of years. And there's always some walk around. Like I've yet to see one that's, that's foolproof, right? Like the ones that I see that maybe that I guess you could throw into that bucket of foolproof. It's like maybe you walk around it, but it detects some type of weird some type of weird activity on the box, and they can't really classify it as maybe as an attack, but it classifies it as just like odd, and it may throw up a flag there. But most security analysts aren't looking for like the odd; they're looking for the red herring, right? They're looking for something that's flashing red across like how the alerting works. I'm just kind of curious, like when it comes to that part of the game, because that's pretty much where we are with the endpoint side of things, right? It's a lot of NDR and EDR stuff. Like, what are your opinions there?
I can speak to, well, actually, Carson, that's you, buddy. You've been so quiet this time. So.
I mean, honestly, it's essential, but at the same time, be aware that it adds extra attack surface. A lot of the 0 days that I've seen trafficked recently happen to be for ADR systems. So even ignoring the bypassing it, a lot of people are looking at just going into it and then infiltrating through there. So definitely keep an eye on your endpoint detection. Yeah.
I would say the one that seems to be throwing the most our way from a defensive standpoint is Defender. And I say that with a caveat. Defender, as deployed properly with proper subscription, where you're leveraging Defender with ATP and you're feeding that into ATA that's well deployed with inside of an Active Directory environment, and that's tuned, it is very difficult to move from like an anomaly or heuristic standpoint. Like it detects anything where credentials haven't been used on the system, this time of day hasn't been used, the location you're coming from isn't used properly. That and all of the telemetry data that Windows is feeding in from all of the other systems worldwide has started to make Defender probably one of the most formidable EDRs that we have to come against. Now, there's some essential things with inside of Windows and legacy support that allows us some great advantages to kind of work through those and bypass them. But from just a raw standpoint, like all of the telemetry that Windows has and its full integration suite to Active Directory and the OS itself with the EDR, it makes it a formidable foe sometimes.
Yeah, it's actually funny you say that because oh crap, we're short on time. But I have seen a lot more companies thinking like, hey, well, maybe I don't need the latest from. I don't want to name a vendor, but I don't need the latest of this particular EDR system, right? Like, I'm gonna just start to build on top of Defender, right? Like, and yeah, I will look at ATA and I will look at ATP, and those are packaged. I think Microsoft has a really good like kind of monopoly here because like, they can package those from a pricing perspective. Like, you can get all three for what you would get for some of the EDR solutions out there. So like, if you're a manager or you're responsible for the budgetary aspect from a security perspective, like it's almost becoming a no-brainer to roll with Defender. Like in reality, like purely from a monetary perspective, right? It's almost becoming like a no-brainer there. Yeah, awesome. Well, I definitely want to thank all you guys for taking some time, spending your Sundays with us. I'll pass it over to Ajit. He's back.
Hi.
Hey.
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Even I seem to have dropped out in the middle. Okay, we do have a couple of questions from the audience. What is the best way to stay undetected while conducting hacking activities?
Custom rolling, whatever you're doing, making sure you're not using out-of-the-box solutions and you're taking the time to understand your environment you're hacking and customizing those very exclusively to that environment. If you spend a little bit of time on the boutique customization of whatever solution you're using and or rolling your own C2, doing it well, that usually is the best means for mitigating detection, taking your time.
Okay. Anyone else wants to also answer that question? Additional points?
What was the question again? Undetected. I'm not. I'd rather you not go undetected. That helps my line of business.
I mean, honestly,
Okay.
Your end goal is to have the client or customer detect you. I mean, like, even if you do go through undetected, you should be fixing that as soon as you're done with your engagement. Like, they're paying you for the report on how to get better, not just so you can show off your cool skills.
Okay, so I don't know the intent behind that question, but we'll keep that open. The next question is, we're not a large company. Should we perform a red team exercise?
I would caveat that and say it depends. It really depends on what your culture is like, what your top buy-in is, and what level of maturity you're at. Well, a red team will get you support, has the awe and shock factor. You can utilize it from an impact standpoint to get buy-in, necessary budgets, show and demonstrate, the lack of capability and response. That's one way. But from the standpoint, you're often better off utilizing something like a purple team engagement where you can cooperatively and cooperatively work with the offensive team to really test and see where you're at, moving through a much more comprehensive engagement out of the gate. And again, that really depends on your maturity. If you really need to test, you've worked really hard the last 5 years, you've got a roadmap, you've built everything, you've got a good detection, you need to test your people to see if what's not working now, and you're at that maturity level, which is usually like maybe 5% of companies, then I would say, yeah, go ahead and get a red team for that standpoint. But there's a lot of other better ways to utilize your time and your money where you're avoiding time-intensive things like phishing or physicals or money-intensive things, and really working through those with your offensive team to kind of build a much more robust strategy around what the gaps are and how to tune whatever you do have in place currently.
Okay,
And
so I think we're done with the questions as well. Sorry, Carson, you had a point to add?
Well, I mean, I'd add on to that most companies that think they need a red team are not to that stage yet. Like he said, a lot of the customers that come to us asking for a red team end up more in the market for a pen test and then recommendations for what systems they need in place rather than testing systems they already have in place. We mostly deal with startups and mid-sized companies.
Okay. The next, we have one more question. Will AI replace pen testing?
It might make some tools maybe no. I think it's still to kind of the discussion we had earlier about the fact that, you know, pen testing is not a matter of deploying scanners and tools. It's a matter of, you know, understanding threats and thinking like an attacker and thinking about weaknesses and access points. Software solutions are going to evolve and get better to help that. Systems are going to evolve to become more secure. And at the same time, attackers are going to evolve to become more skilled. So we're going to constantly have that battle and that evolution in security. And so we're not going to, I think, get to a point where ML is really a solution, especially not on the pen testing side. There are certainly other applications in security around anomaly detection and things like that, where there's maybe a little more applicability.
It'll help improve it, and it will shorten that gap between really good pen testers and pen testers that are doing this well and testing, you know, the humans and the processes. It's really hard to identify us when we are acting just like your user and operating with inside of the constraints of, you know, the normal use case. So ML will shorten that gap and help reduce some of the attack surface a little bit, but it is definitely a little ways out. It's still very immature in its ability to do a lot other than help you shorten your time to detection.
Also on the offense side.
Anyone else? Yeah. Please go ahead.
So basically on the offense, AI can certainly help make sure you don't miss anything, but like honestly, that's just all automated scanners. But I mean, really, it's just a vuln scan if there's not a human behind it. You need critical thinking. You need to identify everything that you're looking at. So ML could help, but like I don't see it ever replacing as on the offense side.
No, there's always got to be a decision at the end of it.
No, please go ahead. We are waiting for more points.
No, I mean one of the critical things that we've been talking about a lot, I mean, this ML and AI discussion is the ability for AI and ML to discover, detect, and identify. Sure, they're great at that. Our jump from a decision tree and its capability and maturity to then hand over responsibility to something that's automated to then act upon something and do an action, we are very, very far off from that. And I think that is where, you know, Skynet comes into play. And I don't think we're going to hand off that control, because stuff gets really, really ugly when you start to talk about, you know, millions of dollars of loss for minutes of downtime, and you're handing that to some decision tree of a machine. I just don't see that happening in the next decade.
Any other points to add?
Fear Skynet.
Okay. So I think that does bring us to the end of the panel. I think we're done with the questions as well. That was definitely a very interesting and very deep discussion on the benefits of red teaming and possibly some of the drawbacks as well. Okay, we do have one more question. Which of the state actors have the best hackers?
Israel, the US.
Israel, okay.
China's all right.
There, Fred, you are.
Russia's just dirty.
China's
Yeah.
What about Russia?
I think Russia's great with financial side. Like they're great at
Russia's dirty.
Yeah, like I would agree. That's a US Israel.
Yeah.
Maybe India. We don't know.
Okay, there, Fred, you got your answer. US and Israel.
The ones that aren't on the list.
Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving us your time. I know it's a Sunday over there. It's Sunday morning. So I'm going to let you all get back to the rest of your weekend, your last day of the weekend. Before I let you go, as always, stay safe, and we look forward to having you back at future events as well. Thank you so much. That was a very, very interesting discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.